Hello, everyone. This is The Sexual Catholic, and I'm your host, Dr. Mark Levant. If you're interested in broadening your understanding of sexuality and/or the sexuality-Catholicism connection, you're in the right place. Thanks for being here today. Let's get into the episode. Hello and welcome to this episode of The Sexual Catholic, a podcast about sexual health and Catholicism that recognizes the complexities of humanity. If you've been raised Catholic and had a shame-based relationship to sexuality, this is a space to deconstruct and reconstruct that in a more positive light. I'm your host, Dr. Mark Levant, and today we'll talk a bit about sexual decision-making. How do we make sexual decisions in a Catholic framework? Normally, when I tell people I study this stuff, this is where the joke comes in. You don't! The Catholic framework is don't do anything sex-related. And then laughter ensues. But this is largely not helpful to those of us living in the 21st century making decisions about sexual activity. So, let's look at some wisdom from Catholicism that extends beyond don't do that, or now that you did, go to confession or you're going to hell. I was going to do this in one episode, but then it got pretty long, and I like to keep them short and digestible, because we're all busy, so I split it up. In the first part, we're going to talk about some things to keep in mind when it comes to sexual decision-making. How has the history of church development on sexual morality shaped this conversation, and where are we now? In the second part, we're going to look at 3 key components in Catholic theology around this stuff that you may or may not have gotten in your previous education or conversations on the topic. So, why are we talking about this? Why is it an episode? Well, as a sexuality educator, a teacher, a professor, usually in colleges and universities, and as a theology professor, actually, this is true of my colleagues in both professions. They both have this experience. We have people disclose to us some of their personal struggles. They might come up and ask about some pretty tough choices that they're making around sexuality. Should I get an abortion? I'm struggling with sexual intimacy in my relationships. What do I do? Or should I report being sexually assaulted by someone I love? As teachers, we seem to create an atmosphere that allows for nuances around these choices, and that is apparently refreshingly different for some people. We seem to be trustworthy enough that people ask these things of us, which is awesome, but sometimes, in my experience, people talk about how alone they feel in thinking these things through, because there aren't many places that they can talk through decisions like this. One of the most common things when it comes to sexual decision-making is engaging in sexual behaviors. Should I or should I not do these sex things? And we'll have an episode on sexual communication, a super important thing for engaging in sexual behaviors with another person. But first and foremost, we need to be clear on the dialogue that's happening inside ourselves. But a quick disclaimer about this 2-part episode. This is not a moral guide of official Catholic teaching. The things contained in these 2 episodes are nuggets of info from the worlds of theology and sexuality that some people have found to be helpful in navigating their life in a sexual way, especially when they feel that other church teachings are too lofty or not helpful in their life experience. These are things people have told me over the years helped them make sense of some of the things in a more reachable way, in a way more down to earth, more in touch with their lives. These are just some musings of a guy who knows some Catholic stuff and a guy who knows some sexuality professional stuff. Now that the disclaimer is there, let's talk about this episode. This episode is near the beginning of this podcast for a couple reasons. The first reason, because most of the time, when people talk about sexuality through a Catholic lens, it almost always has to do with sexual behavior. Well, now that we've heard about the circles of sexuality in the second episode, and now know that sexuality is a broad topic that has to do with a whole bunch of stuff, not just our genitals and what we do with them, nonetheless, sexual behavior and decision-making is a huge piece of what hangs people up here. Feeling shame, condemning themselves, having other people condemn them, or the fear of what other people will say about X, Y, or Z sexual decision. This stuff is almost always the center of the conversation about sexuality and Catholicism. I think I mentioned before, when I was looking to get into a PhD program, I had many connections in the Catholic academic world. So many people were like, go here, do morality, or do ethics, etc. Maybe one or two of them told me to do systematic theology, but almost all of them focused on ethics and morality. In the world of theology, ethics is almost the only place people talk about sexuality. And that's a bit of what we'll talk about today. So the first reason this is up front in the first few episodes of this podcast is because it's relevant for people living in the world as sexual beings. The second reason we're talking about sexual decision-making so early on in this podcast is because a lot of people who get Catholic sexuality education get messages that they just shouldn't do sexual activity and don't ask questions about it. Now, we learned in the third episode that sexuality education is a moral good, and asking questions is great for your own sexual health. But this denial of questions, though often an experience in Catholic education, is very un-Catholic. It's a very un-Catholic way of going about moral decisions. And it's un-Catholic to not respect people's moral agency or their ability to make moral choices and have others respect them. This is what we call moral agency or moral autonomy. So the first reason this is up front is because it's relevant to people's sex lives. The second reason is because many people do not get a good framework or education about this that leads to human flourishing or sexual wellness and sexual integration. My friends and colleagues in the field of theology are some bomb-ass people. If you've never taken a moral theology class before, let me tell you, you're missing out. I mean, not all of them. Some of them do suck. But I know people who teach moral theology and sexual ethics all over the US and the world. And I love when they post things like, day of registration opens and my course is already full. Because what they're teaching, people are hungry to hear. This podcast is not a replacement for a moral theology class. We don't go in-depth in moral theological analysis or anything like that. But we'll look at some moral theology things that can help inform how we live as sexual beings in a way that supports our sexual health, rather than tearing it down with don't do that or narrow understandings of an act-based morality. We'll talk more about that in the second part of this episode. Another quick note for the audience. If you are a moral theologian who loves to split hairs about terms, this episode is not for you. If you like to just be told what to do and not question it, this episode is not for you. If you are trying to understand the Catholic faith in the context of making sexual decisions in the 21st century, this episode might be for you. In the second part, we're going to talk more about some of these key concepts in Catholic moral theology that can help us make sexual decisions mindfully in ways that bring us closer to sexual wholeness. So, let's get on with the content of this episode. We're going to look at a couple things that can be seen as like guiding notes or things to keep in mind in our journey into Catholic moral theology. These notes come from people like Pope Francis, moral theologian James Keenan, and the ethicist I mentioned, I think, in the episode on shame, Mark Jordan. The first of these guiding notes is from Mark Jordan, who's an ethicist that has written extensively in Christian theology around sexuality. And one thing he does to better understand how to operate around sexual ethics is look into the stories of Jesus as an example. In a chapter he wrote in 2016, talking about how Christian churches have focused on sexual sins as some of the worst sins, he says that when they do this, they, quote, have contradicted Jesus' example. They have succumbed to an all too human desire to make sex the central ethical matter. If Christian sexual ethics wants to be faithful to the silence of its scriptures, then it too must resist any exaggeration of sex. The teacher of Christian ethics must imitate an incarnate God who refused to deliver a code for sex or to enshrine it as the singular topic of concern, end quote. Mark Jordan points out that it's all too human to make sex a central ethical matter. And he highlights Jesus' refusal to deliver a code for sex, or to make it a singular topic of concern. When people focus too much on the sexual quote-unquote sins of others, we really miss the point that we are all humans who fail to live perfect lives. When people focus too much on condemning others around matters of sexuality, Mark Jordan suggests that they are not following the example of Jesus here. The second note here is by a pretty famous Catholic, Pope Francis, recently in a documentary about Answers. Pope Francis mentioned that the Church's teaching about sex is still in diapers. Now, this is a great thing to name because few Catholic leaders have named this truth so clearly. It is in diapers. It's in the baby stages of development. It might have a 1,500 or 2,000-year-old history, but the progress of thought and development on it has not been too advanced. What do I mean by that? Well, over the years, the Church has developed complex theologies behind things like grace, or human nature, or sin, or all sorts of theological concepts. Complexities of the how, and the why, and the what it means are all talked about in really great detail. But when we look at sexual theology, or the moral theology around sexuality, there haven't been equal strides in the doctrinal development throughout history. Meaning that a lot of the great theology that has been written or developed hasn't worked its way into church doctrine. In church history, there's a concept called the development of doctrine. This means that doctrine changes and is kind of updated in its language and understanding with new information, things we didn't know in previous centuries. We haven't really done any good updating of Catholic sexual theology over the last couple years, decades, several decades, centuries, in a while. Some of the things need further articulation. Those who work in theology don't often say the church is wrong on something. That's how you get kicked out. We've seen that throughout history. But instead, we say things like, it needs further articulation, as another way of saying how things need to be rewritten or updated. And this does happen. We saw this recently with the doctrine of discovery and the recent condemnation of the very teaching that led to a lot of harm in North America, or what many First Nations people call Turtle Island. And just like other teachings that have caused harm, we see some sexual theology that needs to be updated to be less about exclusion and harm, and more in line with some more recent sexual science. And the third note I want to offer before getting into some theology is moral theologian Jim Keenan's article. Jim Keenan at Boston College wrote an article called "It's Time for a Catholic Ethic That Sees Sexuality as a Gift, Not a Curse." In it, he outlined the historical development of different teachings related to sexuality and its complicated history between celibate life, priests, nuns, friars, and the life of the laity, or people who are not priests, nuns, friars, people who don't take vows into religious life. For example, he notes, quote, "The genesis of masturbation as sinful was precisely dependent upon the vow of chastity for those who chose the ascetical life." I'm going to pause here. A life of asceticism, or an ascetical life, is talking about choosing a life of avoidance of indulgence, to be impoverished, or to deny oneself to focus on God. He's identifying that some of the thought behind masturbation as sinful comes from a celibate framework. Okay, back to the quote. He continues on to say, quote, "What was a sin for a 40-year-old monk in the 8th century became, however, the same sin for a 13-year-old boy or girl in the 13th century. Worse, as we will see, we made it a very grievous sin," end quote. So what used to be a teaching for celibate people became the same type of sin for everyone. Then, over the years, medieval Catholic scholars categorized different acts as minor or major sins. Through that categorization, we get to sexual sins being considered grave or mortally sinful. In the Catholic world, venial or small sins, and then mortal or big sins. So we get to a point that masturbation to release sexual tension and maybe focus better or to get to sleep faster is considered gravely sinful because of an outdated view of human anthropology, an outdated view of sexual science. And our sexual theology hasn't caught up yet. This is what Pope Francis means by it's still in diapers, or it's in its baby stages. We still have a lot of theological work we need to do to bring these teachings into the 21st century, with all the information we have available to us today. So, we see that Jesus didn't make sex a singular ethical concern, that sexual theology is in its baby stages, and current sexual morality developed in part out of some unreflective practices. Before we wrap up and move on to part 2, I want to name an important aspect to decision-making that's pretty core to Catholic morality, and it's super important, especially around sexuality. And that is gaining knowledge and information. Remember the episode on sexuality education and how we discussed it's a moral good to give people the information they need to know about sexuality. Why? Because we can't be expected to make good, informed decisions if we don't know the content of what we're making decisions about. This is why ethicist Bill Madison says, quote, "Put simply, we cannot act rightly if we do not see rightly." End quote. Learning about the world around us is a really important aspect of Catholic moral theology. We can't make good decisions if we don't know what we're making choices about, if we're not fully informed. A really famous moral theologian named Richard Gula puts it this way, quote, "A fundamental axiom of Catholic morality is that morality is based on reality. Asking the right questions to analyze the situation is the way to move towards seeing reality rightly." End quote. There are things we might not know much about, and that's okay. But in order to make good choices, it's important to understand the reality of the world around us, rather than operating from some lofty or disconnected ideals. What is actually going on? What do we see happening around us? What are people in communities different than our own telling us, and how can we listen to that? Listening and learning are key to seeing rightly. And asking the right questions, as Gula says, is key to seeing things a little more clearly than before. This is one of the reasons I love moral theology. They have so many great tools for understanding decision-making that I won't bore you with here. I was just at a conference of theologians during Pride Month, and it was great to see nerds nerding out over all the tools that we have in moral theology to make sense of the world around us. Moral tools like gradualism or lesser evils or probabilism, all sorts of cool stuff that we're not going to get into here. But let's wrap up here so we can get to the second part of this 2-part episode, where we'll talk about some key components when it comes to sexual decision-making, and what the world of sexology can offer here too. Stick around and find out. Thank you all for listening to this episode. If you liked what you heard or otherwise appreciated it, please subscribe and rate the podcast. If you have other thoughts or ideas for future episodes you'd like to share, please email thesexualcatholic@gmail.com. If you or someone you know would like to learn more about the work that I do, for more information, please visit www.marklevand.com. Thank you for tuning in. I hope something in today's episode was helpful, interesting, or otherwise inspiring. Have a great day.